right, thank you everyone for rejoining our program. Our last panel is going to involve a lot of our speakers because this is where we have room for argument and creativity, and we want to see what everyone's perspectives are on alternative options that we haven't already discussed. So we're going to have Mariam Masumi, Swajmi Nasiri, Sharifa Abassi, and Margaret Stock discussing what thoughts they have on this. Just myself, through the chat discussions that we were having, you know, I've seen some references to the EB3 option, student visas, J1s, H2Bs. There's a variety of things I've seen, but also visas in the community that we've heard of, such as the P visas. Are those valid? Should we even consider them? And also discussions about third country processing. Are there any thoughts or suggestions that you may have to pick better processing locations? So I wanted to open up the floor and see who would like to start and get the ball rolling. Go ahead, okay. Margaret, thank you.
I'll start. So you said P visa. I think we have to be really careful as immigration lawyers to use the terminology that is accurate to clients. So I hear P visa a lot, but most of the time people aren't actually talking about a P visa. They're talking about a refugee priority. And so it's not actually a P visa, it's refugee status through P1, P2, or P3 priorities. The P visa is actually like a performer visa. And while I think there might be some Afghans that might qualify for that, you know, they're going to be people coming in to do some athletic activity or concert or, you know, something like that, the P category. So the basics, and I know most of you are probably expert immigration lawyers, but, you know, there's immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas, and there's more than 80 different non-immigrant visa categories. I always go through the alphabet list with every single client because I never know, you know, I'm just a checklist person, and I learned a long time ago in the military, like always follow your checklist. So I have my checklist of the 80 different categories, and every time a client comes in, I go through them just in my head, you know, any possibility of any one of these applying. So Afghans can potentially qualify for student visas, for J visas, maybe a visitor visa, depending on the circumstances. People are planning to marry an American citizen. I go through the whole family tree and double check that they don't have some relative that qualifies them to immigrate now, you know, Child Status Protection Act, potentially. Maybe there's a US citizen parent or grandparent somewhere in the chain. That does happen sometimes. And then of course, I've had some L's occasionally. I mean, those are a nightmare headache depending on the company, but you know, somebody might qualify for an L, intercompany transferee. An O visa. O visas are your friend. You know, lots of Afghans are potentially outstanding. And you know, the standard for that is complicated, and we probably don't have time to go into it, but you can make out a case if the person is a famous lawyer in Afghanistan or a female rights activist, or, you know, potentially been in the news at all about something, you know, they might potentially qualify for an O. I've gotten O's for all kinds of people over the years. And I know a long time ago, people were laughing at a certain first lady for having allegedly been an O, but it's not that hard to get somebody an O if you're a good lawyer. So I didn't think that particular first lady necessarily that was laughable that she qualified. She just probably had a really good attorney, you know. So there were plenty of Afghans who might qualify for an O. Not so sure about the P, but you know, you got to look at the facts. And then of course, religious workers potentially. Our all-time favorite ST and U visas. Crime victim visas can apply to people who had a crime committed against them outside the United States. If they were a victim of some American military crime, potentially. I actually had an Afghan case years ago where the family was a victim of American war crimes, and they qualified for a U visa, even though the crime wasn't inside the United States, because there's an exception in the rules for, you know, when the US military people do bad stuff to people. So I basically, you know, look at T visas potentially. You want to go through your whole alphabet list and be creative. And you'll find lots of interesting possibilities if you do that, which we can all share widely on our listservs.
Yeah, and the reason I referenced P visa that way is because it's been
Right.
such a common reference as if it's some easy thing to get or it applies to everyone. Meanwhile, there's P1A, P1B, you know,
Right.
P2,
So they're
P3.
talking about
There's
refugee. Yeah, they're
right.
talking about applying for a refugee program overseas, which is going to take a few years. You know, it's not like a visa that you're going to get right away. Yeah. So
Right. And I wanted you to kind
I'm
of
really
express
glad you
that.
mentioned that, because that's like, I want a P visa. I hear that from everybody. You know, it's like, wait a
Right.
minute. Do you know what a P visa is? Okay, hold on.
I also hear people who have been evacuated and they're paroled in and they're like, I want to apply for P visa. I'm like, no, P visa gets you here, then you gotta do it. One of the things I know we all saw in the news, and I'm sure Sharifa John can share some of her insight, is domestic violence prevalent on the bases for a U visa. And not that I want to separate families, but if potentially that spouse, more likely the female that's been, you know, abused. But if the abuse happened on the military base or now they're off the military base, there has to be a police report. There has to be cooperation. I do hundreds of U visas every year. The requirements are you have to be a victim of a qualifying crime. You have to have cooperated with law enforcement, meaning you wanted to press charges, and you potentially suffered physical, emotional, and or both harm. So not the best way to go, but if it's inevitably, you know, an organization that's working with the client, that's one option. I have a lot of clients who had an I-130 filed either for their parents or their US citizen spouse had filed for their spouse, or a green card holder had filed and they got evacuated. I've done maybe about a dozen and a half of those. If the I-130 was approved and they got evacuated, then it's a pathway to the I-45 adjustment of status. In the beginning, I had challenges of getting the I-94s. You know, some entered without a passport, so I had to show that they were lawfully admitted or paroled in. I couldn't get the medical examinations that were half done or incorrectly done or whatever the heck they were done. The challenge is getting a record that they had the vaccination so that I could do a new I-693 here. So I have filed a few of them, letting them know that, hey, I don't have access to the medical records. You have it, go get it somehow, give it to me so I don't have to duplicate the vaccinations again for my clients. So I'm anticipating a lot of challenges. So family-based, I have a lot of a few clients who in the first maybe 4 or 5 days of the evacuation were lucky enough to have evacuated their mom, dad, brothers, sisters, everybody that they could get on, and then they got on. And then later in the process, I had a client who was a spouse of a US citizen, went through the horrendous process to get in the airport in Kabul. She was a spouse of a US citizen when approved I-130, didn't get in later in the evacuation. So it's heartbreaking stories that we hear, but for those cases that you have documentarily ready, maybe Margaret can give some insight onto this, or Sharifa or Mariam, but I'm having a difficult time getting the damn embassy at Islamabad to expedite the Afghan cases. I've had about a dozen clients who were documentarily ready that they got a visa to Pakistan, and they've been pending for 8-9 months. They're supposed to expedite them, but Islamabad sends a rude email that says everybody has to wait in line. So the relative petition is one way. And like Margaret said, the T visa, some other exceptions. The student visas, you got to prove the intent that the person is going to return. That has been a challenge. I was able to help some local universities get a J1, not only for the person, but the spouse and the individual. So those are sort of the ways to go. But the key word is there's no quick fix. Everything is going to take time. And unfortunately, these are hard and deep conversations to be having with people. And especially those on the bases there, they want to get a hold of anybody they can, and they're asking the same questions 100 times from different people. So those are some of the ways. I don't know if Mariam, John, and Sharifa, John, you guys have any thoughts on Any other options or what you've had experience?
Yeah, a couple of the other options that I've actually personally seen would maybe be VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act. I have 2 cases that I'm doing right now for recently arrived Afghan women who had a US citizen spouse here that they came to be reunited with, but unfortunately we're now going down the path of VAWA. And obviously the benefit of VAWA is that you can apply, if you're inside of the United States, you can apply for the VAWA petition through Form I-360 and concurrently file an I-485 with it. And sometimes it might be more beneficial than a U visa, although you can absolutely pursue both paths. But VAWA leads directly to a green card, whereas a U visa does take a minimum of about 5 years or so to get processed. Fortunately, now they are allowing for an EAD while a U visa is pending, but once you do get the U visa status, you have that for a minimum of 3 years before you can even apply for adjustment. So screening for both the U and VAWA in some situations, it's helpful. And then VAWA, in my experience, tends to be something that's a little bit more of a direct pathway towards the green card. And also special immigrant juvenile status. I know there is a fair number of unaccompanied Afghan minors inside of the United States. I imagine that in some of those cases, SIJS would be an appropriate remedy for them. So that's also some of the two things that I don't think we've gotten a chance to discuss that I've personally seen, and I think many of you could see in your experience with Afghans.
And I'd echo what Mariam says there with the I-360, especially with the current process. My recent experience with them is they're giving work authorization like really fast now. It's been shocking, you get a work permit like automatically issued like really quickly, which is very, very nice.
I also wanted to echo what Mariam said about the SIJS, Special Immigrant Juvenile Status for the unaccompanied minors. There was a large number, there was quite a few unaccompanied minors that have come through the evacuation. And by virtue of being an unaccompanied minor, I think, that if they meet the other 3 factors, they would qualify for SIJS. In fact, I have a case who I'm considering filing SIJS for. But also, the SIJS process does take a little bit longer, and these kids are also eligible for asylum as well. You can also file for asylum for them. So you have to make a determination what's the best route for your client. And I think because asylum is the faster route for them, and they can include their family members, because remember with SIJS, they won't ever be able to file for their parents if they get their green card through SIJS. So in that instance, you have to make the determination as to what's the best route for your client. And because of the expedited processing for Afghans, I think asylum might be the better option for them. If it comes choosing between SIJS and asylum. Also, like Margaret said, H-1Bs, employment-based petitions are also an option for some of these folks, because a lot of them are well qualified, they are educated, they do come with a lot of experience, and sometimes there are employers willing to sponsor them. So that can be one route for them to pursue.
I'll mention 2 cases that I've had that we had remedies that haven't been talked about yet. So I had a couple of Afghan children get paroled in at Dulles Airport, and it turned out they were US citizens. So you do have to do that screening to make sure that they didn't derive US citizenship from somebody, because these particular kids, although they got paroled in and apparently CBP didn't realize they were citizens, they were US citizens. So I'm doing N-600s for them. So just be aware of that. And then I had another kid who got paroled in, who I shouldn't say child, who had a guardianship paper from the Afghanistan legislature for his so-called parent. He was an orphan and had been delivered over to the custody of an Afghan man and his wife, even though they were not the biological parents. So we could have done an SIJ, but it turns out that we can actually go ahead and do an adoption in the United States. And again, this is really complicated stuff, so you don't want to be doing an adoption unless you absolutely know what you're doing, because sometimes you can adopt and then the child's not eligible for anything. But in this particular case, because of the convoluted, complicated facts not worth going into, The adoption is actually going to turn the kid into the couple's child under the INA because they've had legal and physical custody of this child for more than 2 years. And so as soon as they do the adoption, the kid's going to become eligible to get a green card. And as soon as the kid gets a green card, then the kid will automatically turn into an American because one of the parents is an American citizen. So this was a kid who would have been technically an unaccompanied minor coming in, except that it turns out the father had this piece of paper from the legislature of Afghanistan giving him this child as his ward, essentially. They don't do adoptions in Afghanistan that are recognized as adoptions under international law or by the US government. But he had an official paper from the government making him the guardian of this child. So I just throw that out. You got to screen for potential US citizens in the paroled crowd. And then adoption might work, but you have to be really careful because, as most of you I think probably know, there's this Hague Convention, and then there's orphan adoptions, and those are supposed to be done overseas. So if the child's already in the United States, you're looking at the 2 years of physical and legal custody rule. And if it's from a non-Hague state, you're usually okay with that. It's a Hague state, you can't do that without complying with Hague unless they're habitually resident in the United States. So it gets a little bit complicated, but in this particular case, the adoption is going to turn the kid into their child under the INA.
The other thing I just wanted to mention, not necessarily a permanent option, but TPS has been designated for Afghans, and we're waiting for the federal registry to come out. Based on my research and my knowledge and echoing all my colleagues, even if they have humanitarian parole, they could potentially apply for TPS.
Yes.
To reserve that over and over. If somebody has the parole status, they can still get the benefits, but if they're just getting strictly TPS, they're not eligible for the benefits, but it doesn't affect their eligibility for benefits if they get both. So I think the next influx of need for the community is going to be helping with the TPS applications, as well as, asylum and all the other stuff that we're dealing with.
Right, and I'd highly encourage people to apply for TPS because it's been the historical case that when large populations of people get granted TPS, at some point, Congress comes along and figures out some solution for most of them. This seems to happen regularly. It happened most recently with the Liberians, and they actually didn't have TPS per se. They had deferred enforced departure, which is kind of another kind of sort of TPS kind of like thing. But if there's a huge population of people with TPS in the country, at some point, Congress is going to be pressured to give them a path to a green card. And that's happened many, many times in the past. So another reason to encourage people. We also had, this is all historical now, but does anybody remember the Nicaraguan and Central American Relief Act, which covered the Soviet Union? I mean, I still have a few people coming through that I'm still getting green cards for, who qualified under that because they had happened to apply for asylum, years and years ago, and they were from the former Soviet Union. So it's not out of question that at some point somebody is going to feel mercy for all the Afghans on TPS and give them a path to a green card. Maybe it'll be the Afghan Adjustment Act or something else, but the fact that they qualified or applied for TPS might be determinative of whether they are eligible for benefits. So I definitely encourage people to do that. And then I have another out of the box solution that occasionally works for people, which is we're a global community. And we have this northern neighbor, actually, where I'm located in Anchorage, Alaska. It's really like our eastern neighbor. But Canada, in some cases, nothing's working out very well in the United States, or it's going to take a really, really, really long time. But the Canadians have this very logical immigration law, which I'm continually impressed with. And I've had a fair number of clients over the years who got frustrated with the United States of America and were welcomed with open arms by what most of you would call your northern neighbor, my eastern neighbor. Express entry to Canada for people who speak French and English and are educated. They get green cards within a really short period of time. And of course, they're Canadian green cards, but Canada is a really nice country and a lot of people like it. And of course, once you're a Canadian citizen, you can potentially get a treaty NAFTA visa and come back to the United States. And I actually have some Afghans that a long time ago went to Canada and now they're back in the US as Canadian citizens on treaty NAFTA. So not totally off your checklist options. There's also other countries out there that they might want to think about, like New Zealand or Australia or something, but the US immigration system is not terribly logical. Canada's is a lot more skills-based and checklist oriented, and people can qualify. A lot of Afghans can qualify for immigration in Canada.
What about the discussion we were having in the chat, or people were referencing, I believe Claudia was one of them, about the availability of jobs in Ocean City, seasonal employment, or J1s. Is that something we should be advocating or, considering when we're advising clients?
So with the J1, you have to have a program that you're going to be part of that's allowed to sponsor somebody for a J1, and then you have to be, placed somewhere that complies with the terms of the J1 program. And if you go look at the State Department's website for J1s, you'll see there's hundreds of J1 programs out there. Everything from high school exchange student to au pair, summer camp counselor, college work study, professors, researchers, short-term scholars, specialists. So I don't know, we can give a global answer on the J1 other than to say it's really fascinating visa. There's no quotas for it. There's all kinds of different people that qualify for J1s.
An agency.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool, but you have to go investigate it on the State Department's website. You have to find a program sponsor. I once got involved with J1 programs for a young woman from Turkmenistan who wanted to come to the United States and stay at my house for a year, and was in high school. And she was a J1. So she came over courtesy of the United States government and was just paying for the whole thing. As a high school exchange student, J1, going to high school next door, 5-minute walk from my house, had a great time, loved Alaska. And then she came back on a J1 once she was in college. She ended up going to college in Russia, of all places. This was long ago, before evil Mr. Putin took over. And so she was going to college in Russia as a Turkmenistan citizen and qualified for the US J1 summer work travel program. So she came back to Alaska to work in a lodge in the wilderness in the middle of Wrangell St. Elias National Park, which is this beautiful national park nobody's ever heard of. It's the biggest national park in the United States. Come visit us sometime. And she had a grand summer, making a ton of money, working at this lodge, and having wonderful time before going back. But there's all kinds of different J programs. So I don't know, we can give a global answer about that. I think most of the Afghans are people looking at maybe college or professors or short-term scholar, but it might be that there's somebody out, some other category they qualify in. J's are non-immigrant visas, so you have to show non-immigrant intent.
So I was able to help at San Jose State here in the Bay Area for 2. Then it was the main applicant, and they were both females, and then they had spouses and children. For one, we got it right away, and they're at San Jose State. And then the second one, they went into some other questioning, and then I didn't follow up, but it's possible. At this point, I think like Margaret said, if you can get creative and just try every avenue, but then always being honest with the client that there's no quick fix, that these are just trial and error. And sometimes we do get lucky. But like I said, like maybe 3 months ago, one at least, got the J1 and they're here in San Jose State. But the costs there's certain portions of cost that the program will cover. The rest of it, you're gonna have to show. Luckily for this family, she had family members local who were able to submit their taxes to show support. So if you're able to get someone to provide the support for them in addition to what the program offers, the chances are better. It's worth trying. And it's so subjective. You might get an officer who's like not going to do it at all. For example, I was doing the Ukrainian and I did a B2. I had everything ready and looked at it for 2 minutes and denied them. And then I did another one the next day for someone else at Moldova, US Embassy, and they got it. So it was the same preparation. So it's also who they get and, draw luck. So just whatever things you can try. I mean, I think they're worth trying if the client is willing to do that, with the understanding that there's no guarantee that anything may work.
And then when you're screening your clients, make sure you check to see if anybody's related to somebody who's not from Afghanistan, because that might open up other visa possibilities. Somebody might be married to somebody, say, who is married, we'll just throw it out because it's mentioned, to a Ukrainian. Okay, well, Ukrainians are eligible for E2 visas, small business investor visas. And so if they're married to a Ukrainian, the Ukrainian can apply for a small business investor visa, you know, to run an ice cream shop or a restaurant or something. And that means a spouse qualifies for a work permit. They don't have to be a national of the treaty country. So screen for that too. That might open up possibilities for you.
Also in the kind of the DC metropolitan area, we obviously see like a lot of diplomats, and I know that the Afghan embassy recently closed in Washington, DC. So another thing, if you do get like that special kind of client that might be a diplomat or a family member of a diplomat, sometimes you can screen for Section 13 adjustment of status. Done a couple of those in the past, but they give about 50 of those out a year, and there are certain eligibility criteria where you have to have shown that you were previously on an A or a G visa, and you know, your diplomatic status was terminated. And obviously, with the current situation in Afghanistan, the government in Afghanistan, it might be a decent case, especially because one of the things you have to show is compelling reasons why you can't go back. And traditionally, what they look at is, you know, is it because of the regime? And the classic scenario is if there's like been a coup d'etat or something like that. And I think this is a little bit similar.
This is it. This should be the one that qualifies them. Yep,
Exactly.
I definitely agree with you on that. I think the diplomats should be a pretty easy case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I know with this area, like we have a lot of that. So something to look out for.
Okay, so somebody in the chat, filing labor certifications for unskilled labor is a path to green card. Absolutely. Unfortunately, filing labor certifications requires an employer who's willing to presumably hire a lawyer, because I don't know anybody who can get through that process without a good lawyer. But it is relatively easy right now to get labor certification for unskilled people because the US labor market's so bad at the moment. And of course, it's a complicated process. You got to know what you're doing with DOL, but Elaine, who posted the question, is, I think, good at doing perms. So if they can find a perm lawyer, definitely give it a shot. The problem there again is going to be when they want to adjust status, they have to comply with 245K. So the labor certification is not the end of the road. And then Patty posted about 245I. And 245I might be an option. You have to go figure out if they're grandfathered. But I think most of the Afghans are entering legally, so they might not need 245I, but maybe they could use that if they had an employment-based case and didn't qualify under 245K. So it's worth checking. Someone asked, this is Tilly's question, if your client has YouTube interviews of themselves on the news in another language, what's the best way to present that at the asylum office and Eoir stage? So that's kind of two different forums. So asylum office doesn't like electronic anything. They want everything reduced to paper, from what I can tell. So when I have a video, what I do is screenshot it and I provide a translation with a certification from a translator. I do that regularly. And YouTube also has captions, so you can get the audio reduced to, you know, transcript. And then with Eoir, you're going to have to figure out whether your judge is going to let you show the video. Most of them probably don't want to bother with that, but they theoretically can have you show the video in court. If they don't like that, you can use the same method that I mentioned I use at the asylum office, which is to screenshot everything and put it into the record as paper.
One thing I wanted to mention for all of you guys, you know, that are going to be taking or you are working with clients, is language barriers is an extreme challenge. Being on the military bases, you know, they had access to translators. One of the things I saw early on was the challenge when people get off the military bases, the need for translators. For those of you not familiar, Dari is different than Farsi. If you are having interviews for your clients in asylum, I can tell you wholeheartedly, please, as soon as you know that the translator is speaking Farsi, which is Iranian, completely different, stop the interview and request a Dari speaker. This client will be freaked out. I'm a very educated person in terms of coming languages, and I still have very difficulty with, I was at a USCIS interview and it was a Dari speaker who was translating. And he said to me, if I was educated, I would not speak Farsi. And I said, okay, you need to move on, and I'm going to stop the interview. So I've had very, very bad experiences. For those of you who are going to be working with client Pashto, finding translators is a difficult. One of the things I did early on from the Afghan American Conference Organization and myself, we teamed up with Tarjumly. I'm putting it in the chat, and I'll put my email if you need the videos, if you need the flyers on how to use it. Tarjumly is an app for free. You can get a free translator within 2 minutes that's been vetted. They're volunteers that will translate for you. If you're doing a conference call with your client, they do have a fee, but you can get it waived. And you can just contact me and I can connect you with the person. So Tarjum has been a lifeline for a lot of people, especially here in the rural areas of like Turlock and Sacramento, where Pashto speakers are not readily available. So again, in all the work that you're doing, you're going to run into a challenge of translators. The other thing I would echo is that please understand that, you know, all these people that came in, they came from various backgrounds. Some come from very remote areas of Afghanistan that have very little education and understanding. I remember being in a tent with like 400 guys, and they all spoke Pashto. And one of them said, I understand what you're saying, but I have no idea what you're saying. So you have to be slow, you have to be methodical, you have to repeat things. Some didn't even know how to use their phones or their emails. And so when you're working with these clients, there are other challenges to keep in mind that you may not run into other issues. So I put the Tarjumly there for anybody who may want to use it. We are all readily available to, all right, I don't want to volunteer my co-panelists. They're going to get mad at me, but you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat if you need anything in terms of guidance and stuff. There's a lot of resources, and I just hope that more people step up and take these cases because the need is great.
Thank you so much. It appears that we have a question about the actual application for humanitarian parole. Any actual materials and these recordings will be uploaded and disseminated to attendees by Monday, I believe. So if there is going to be kind of a breakdown or checklist on HP, it will be provided at that time. Otherwise, I don't believe there was any specific material as to that. If anyone would like to touch on that before we finalize our conversation today, that'd be great. Otherwise, I think just look out for the recordings and the handouts when that's sent out.
I mean, the documents for an Afghan humanitarian parole case will obviously vary from applicant to applicant. It definitely depends on the reasons as to why the individual is seeking humanitarian parole. Again, you have to show that there's an urgent, compelling humanitarian reason. So in some situations, if you have individuals who previously worked for the US Armed Forces and they have proof of that, maybe they're not SIV eligible or P2 eligible for some reason, they can provide evidence of that relationship, of that work, declarations, obviously, detailing why it is that they're seeking humanitarian parole, detailing any threats that they've received in the past, any harm that they've been subjected to. That's absolutely helpful. I kind of look at them like asylum cases if the basis for the humanitarian parole is based on a targeting or threats of harm or harm that you have faced. Obviously, there are other reasons where you can request humanitarian parole, like for medical reasons or some of the things we talked about in an earlier panel to tend to sick relatives. So sometimes, again, with humanitarian parole, it is a very challenging process for Afghans as it is, but you can use all of the various reasons. It doesn't necessarily have to be tied to I'm going to be threatened or killed by the Taliban. So exploring the story, that person's story with them is really critical, just to make sure that you're looking at every potential component that could help support their request. If anybody else wants to chime in, they can.
I just wanted to add as a practice point, again, when I was in the military bases, when you ask an Afghan, you know, what's your ethnic background, your religious, are you Shia, Sunni, it's like a target on their back. I think there has to be some cultural competency. So when you're asking a question, you want to lay down the foundation. And I saw some guys just freeze up Even being, I'm a Pashtun speaker, so I'm considered Pathan. And when I saw the Hazaras, they were hesitant to talk to me. And I was just like, I had to build that as even as an Afghan to say, this is America. I'm asking you because there's potentially an avenue to get services. So I think the work that we do, and with any immigrant community, we need to have some sense of cultural competency, in particular with this traumatized group. Just imagine the horrific conditions they went through in Kabul, and then the lily pads, and then the safe havens that they spent months on. Some of them were not in great conditions. And when I first started going to the bases, I didn't really have an end game, but I'm glad I did, because I see narrative coming out that are not the narratives that I saw. And so I'm like, whoa, wait, that's not what I saw. So for example, at Bliss, in the middle of the desert with New Mexico, the conditions were not, and that's why they closed it down. So people are really traumatized. And so just having some cultural competency, and if you don't know how to approach it, there are a lot of cultural competency resources that could be shared when you're dealing with this really, really traumatized community. You'll also see a lot of times the men will be speaking, the women are more looking down, they're quiet, they don't talk, or usually the men will come. And I think the downfall to that is sometimes the woman may have a stronger asylum case than the man. And so you got to figure out how to communicate that to that client. Sometimes they've been advocating that if the male files an asylum case, they can add the wife. And then maybe if the wife has a strong case, she can file an asylum claim, put the husband as a derivative. So there are different factors to link to, but I think cultural competency is very, very important.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we finished this panel a little early. I suppose Mariam and Cynthia have some closing remarks and would like to thank the panelists for today. So I myself also would like to thank the panelists. I've learned so much. I've taken so many notes, and I'm excited to get all the material as well. So thanks for taking the time so that we can all better advocate for this population, as well as, extend it to other clients who might have applicable cases. So thank you all so much, and it's nice to meet everyone.
I'd like to thank Sherry and Mariam, who really put together these phenomenal panels. All the great work that Sherry did on this. Obviously, we want to thank our panelists because they have put so much of their time and energy into helping us help others. I also want to thank Angela Monroe, who has been immeasurable help in putting this together, and as always. And I just hope that everyone on this call is, if you weren't already energized, you're re-energized to go out there and do some good.